Welcome everyone to another episode of Problems and Solutions, where I complain about stuff in War Thunder, but I do try and provide some of my own helpful solutions. Today we're looking at top tier tank realistic battles, and some of the problems I've identified from playing, along with some issues I've seen from other players and from forums. As most of you know who have seen this series already, these are just my opinions, so please do let me know if you agree or disagree, and of course let me know your own personal opinions in the comment section below. Either way, I hope you enjoy. So for any of you that have played top tier tank RB, I'm sure you can relate to some of these issues, and I've broken it down into 5 main problems, and these are the matchmaking, maps, vehicle strength, missing content, and of course traction. Now firstly I'll talk about these issues, and then I'll discuss the solutions at the end. Now the first main issue with top tier tank RB, in my opinion, is the way that matchmaking works. If you've played top tier, you'll know that usually the games end up as the US and Britain versus every other nation. Now this poses a couple of issues, firstly being the design of NATO ammunition. NATO tank ammunition is optimised to penetrate sloped armour, and that's the armour that's seen on the T-80 and T-72 tank designs, and also things like the T-64, T-62 and all the other Soviet era tanks. And not so much the flatter armour seen on the Leopard 2A4, Leopard 2A5 and STRV-122. Now, although this alone is only a very small issue, it does however become a bigger factor in the grand scheme of things, which you'll understand in a minute. Now, although I appreciate all tanks have their weak spots, such as the sides, rear and gun breech, the Soviet tanks and Russian tanks don't have any negatives from this, whilst also using ammunition that is specifically designed to penetrate the flatter armour like the turret face of an M1. Now this leads me to my next part, maps. At least in my experience, almost all the maps I get at top tier are more orientated towards close quarter battle, maps like Advance to the Rhine and Sweden for example, and not long range maps like Maginot Line. Now this poses 2 major issues to players of NATO tanks. If you look at the armour layout of NATO main battle tanks, all the armour is focused in the turret with very limited armour in the hull. Whereas Soviet and Russian tanks have armour focused all over the front of the hull and turret face, with NATO tanks having such a tall profile when compared to Russian and Soviet tanks, they have enormous weak spots. So at close range, this obviously leaves a very small margin of error for NATO players, whereas Russian and Soviet players can almost click and kill everything they encounter. Now bear with me because this will lead to my next point, but just quickly I'd like to mention the other issue with maps, and this doesn't come down to gameplay, but it comes down to the like, dislike and banning of maps in the matchmaker. Now at least in my experience, it doesn't work. I for example have the Japan map banned with dislikes on as many of the close quarter maps as I possibly can. I seem to get those maps the most, no matter whether or not I'm playing in a squad or playing alone. Now my liked maps are maps like Maginot Line and Sands of Sinai, and I almost never get them. I only ever get the close quarters maps when I'm playing top tier. In fact, Japan is almost always the first map I play when I get online to play War Thunder. Whenever I play any kind of tank game, Japan is like the #1 map that shows up. Now, linking to my original point about maps, we can also talk about vehicle strengths. As I mentioned, NATO tanks have very good turret armour and very weak hull armour, and this is due to a more historic design of being in a hull-down defensive position to defend against an onslaught of Soviet armour should the Cold War ever have turned hot. So a major strength for NATO tanks is long-range engagements, where they can get hull down, and although it doesn't necessarily make it easier to kill a Soviet or Russian tank, it gives that extra level of protection to the NATO player. Now, without many long-range maps, NATO tanks can barely fight in their own advantages, especially when they're already fighting against other NATO tanks in matchmaking, whereas Russian and Soviet players don't have any of the negative effects from this. Now, as you can see, this is also linking back to my original point about the matchmaking, how it's the US and Britain always fighting every other nation. The NATO players are now fighting against other tanks that have the same advantages and disadvantages. Although this is a very double-edged sword, when combined with the other previous points, it does start to become a major issue. Now, moving on, we're going to talk about my single biggest gripe about War Thunder and top-tier tanks. Now, that is missing content. And now what I mean by this is not missing vehicles. I don't mind so much that they don't have every variant of NATO tank in-game, but I do mind when it comes to adding more and more powerful Russian and Soviet tanks to the tech trees and not adding the more basic things to NATO tanks. Being a British player, I'd like to have access to the L27A1 Sabre round, especially since it's better than the current L26 in-game and it entered service in 1999. It would give the British players in the Challenger 2 a much better capability against T-80s and the T-72s. The US M1A1 and A2 are both missing all sorts of armour upgrade packages that would increase their survivability, especially at close range. These packs include Tusk with ERA bricks on the side of the hull and SEP upgrades which would give better thermal imaging to the CITV and gunner. Now, if you compare all this to the Russian and Soviet tanks, they already have pretty much everything that they have in real life, which again puts the NATO tanks at a disadvantage, with the Russians having no serious negative effects from it. Now, with that being said, we're going to take a slight deviation from tanks and briefly talk about helicopters in Tank RB. The longbow radar on the Apache still doesn't have their fire and forget longbow Hellfires. yet the Ka-50 still has access to all of its real-world weaponry. Yet there is also the variant of Tiger, I can't remember whether it's the German one or the French one, that has access to fire and forget rockets as it is, or fire and forget missiles, should I say. So it doesn't really make sense to me that the Apache still doesn't have access to fire and forget Hellfires. I honestly feel like this is just a way of Gaijin trying to balance a potentially very powerful helicopter. And I don't think that there is any reason not to add the Longbow Hellfire, especially when you look at the capabilities of different surface-to-air missiles in game. Now, before we move on, I'd like to quickly mention that although we've only talked about the L-27 round and the armor packages for the Abrams, it is worth mentioning, though, that there is a lot more content that Gaijin could add but haven't. For example, the armor packages for the Bradley, the CITV upgrades for the Bradley, the CITV for the Challenger 2. They were just the two things that kind of primarily came to mind when I was writing the script for this. Now, moving on to probably the smallest change that Gaijin have made to Tank RB. As a whole, not just top tier, this goes to everyone, but has had probably the biggest impact. Now, Gaijin, in an effort to nerf some of the more overpowered spots in maps, decided to lower the amount of traction that vehicles could get, along with also blocking off these spots in one way or another, whether it be with tank traps, invisible walls, whatever. Now, I can't understand why they decided to nerf traction, because now main battle tanks and any kind of vehicle really are now unable to traverse harsh terrain like they're supposed to. Like, a tank is specifically designed to be able to go to places where armoured cars can't go. Like, they have tracks so that they can traverse harsh terrain. And now, that's near impossible for a tank to do it. It just doesn't make any sense to me. Now, at least in my experience, the only vehicles ever to get into these positions were the wheeled vehicles such as the Radkampfwagen and the Type 16. Now, these vehicles don't suffer from the traction nerf. It's only the tracked vehicles that suffer from the traction nerf, which, again, doesn't really make any sense. But anyways, these are the 5 main issues that I think I've identified in War Thunder top tier tanks. Now, moving on, we're going to discuss some of the solutions. Now, obviously, I've focused mostly on US and British tanks, and this is for one main reason. I think that the Challenger 2 and M1s are hindered by all the above reasons specifically. I think top tier at the moment is heavily focused on giving Russian and Soviet players the best possible experience, and kind of sidelining the NATO players. Now, a solution that I found to the matchmaking would simply be to tier Soviet and Chinese players against everyone else, and this is because of how Russian teams dominate top tier games and mostly get maps that benefit their tanks. It would also make games slightly more historically accurate, which is exactly what I like, which is what anyone who's been watching my channel for any period of time would know, that I like historically accurate games, even if you're in a slight disadvantage. It also gives the potential for NATO players to use more of their strengths to their advantage rather than having to fight against tanks with the same capabilities as them. I think a good fix to the map size issue is to put bigger maps more frequently at top tier, and I'm not saying to remove all the close quarter maps, because we all do enjoy the close quarter maps from time to time, but I don't want to be playing top tier at close quarters every single time, because it means I can never play to my strengths. However, I would like to see around a 50-50 split for the big maps and the close quarters battle maps, and that way it gives some variety, and it also means that both teams at some point can play to their advantage. I know that's a very difficult thing to achieve, but it would be a good thing to aim for at least. Now, the obvious fix with missing content is to add that missing content, although I do understand that that is easier said than done. Now, some of the information regarding armor packages and shell types and ballistics are going to be classified. I'm not sure how much of the information about the L-27 is classified, I'm not sure how much of the information for the Tusk packages is classified, I'm not sure how much of the information for the SEP packages are classified, but the one thing we have to understand is that some of the content is classified. However, I feel like there's a lot of information out there for Gaijin to make a more than educated guess on how to add this missing content, because unfortunately it's becoming more and more frustrating to not join the meta and play tanks like the T-80 and the T-72. Now, traction I think can be easily fixed by just reverting back to the old system, because it worked fine and everyone was happy with it, and I'm sure pretty much everyone who's watched this video this far can agree with me that the new traction is one of the most frustrating aspects of War Thunder currently. Now, overall, with the new update coming, some of these points may become invalid, but I doubt very much will change, and I really hope to see some change in top tier to make the game at least a little less frustrating for the NATO players. But hey, I'm not a huge influencer in the War Thunder community, and I don't have much say at all. As I say, these are simply my opinions, so please let me know what you think in the comment section below, whether or not you agree or disagree. Thank you all very, very much for watching, and of course, if you're new here, please consider subscribing, leave me a like if you enjoyed today's video, and I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.